The battle between Arrax and Vhagar and the untimely and apparently accidental death of Lucerys served as the climax of House of the Dragon's first season, and it's safe to say that it wasn't a fair fight. Although Aemond seemingly wasn't intending to kill his nephew when they faced off above Storm's End, it's not exactly surprising that Luke wound up dead considering that Vhagar was so monstrously larger than Arrax that she could literally consume the rival dragon in one bite. It's clear based on the cinematography alone that House of the Dragon wanted to portray this as a David versus Goliath showdown. But one of the most interesting details about this entire event is that Arrax really was canonically so small. Fire and Blood doesn't spell out the particulars of the dragon sizes in literal measurements, but within the book canon, Vhagar is a Godzilla-sized beast and Arrax is 1/5 the ancient she-dragon size. Given their age disparity alone, it's not hard to overlook the size difference, as Vhagar has had over a century to grow to her size, while Arrax is only a teenager. However, Arrax's size and the size of the dragons who lived through the Dance of the Dragons is actually a fascinating facet of the storyline at large. Because, while most viewers might write off Arrax's diminutive size in relation to Vhagar as nothing more than a sign of the dragon's youth, that is very clearly not the true reason behind it, as Daenerys' 3 dragons seem to objectively prove. Arrax and Luke are basically meant to be the same age because Arrax's egg hatched when Luke was a baby, meaning that the dragon is around 14 years old when Luke and Arrax are both killed over Shipbreaker Bay. In comparison, Drogon, Velaryon, and Rhaegal are at best 3 or 4 years old when Daenerys invades Westeros in Game of Thrones, meaning that they have seemingly managed to grow to 10 times Arrax's size in probably a quarter of the time. And although A Song of Ice and Fire is still incomplete, Dany hatches her dragons in 299 AC, and just a year later in 300 AC, Drogon is already big enough for Daenerys to ride. So in both book and show canon, the development of some dragons is absurdly advanced in contrast to others, and the very obvious question is, why? In Fire and Blood in the fictional histories of Westeros, the collapse of dragons as a species is understandably a point of specific interest, largely because it was so drastic and so fast. Unfortunately for the Targaryens, even before the Dance of the Dragons began, the animals that their power was based on were on a rapid decline. While beasts like Balerion, Vhagar, and Caraxes grew to unfathomably large and powerful creatures, little more than 100 years later, the dragons that were hatching were becoming smaller and smaller. So, while Arrax's size is comical and pitiful in House of the Dragon, he's not the only dragon who couldn't compete with his elders. Obviously, the extinction of the dragons is one of the strangest curiosities in the world of Ice and Fire, and the fact that they declined so rapidly throughout just a few generations is bizarre. There are many speculations that organizations within Westeros whose power was reduced by the Targaryen invasion, such as the Maesters of the Citadel or the Faith of the Seven, were behind the doom of the dragons. And those are some plausible theories. Both of these forces would have had good reason to want the dragons and Targaryens gone, and they basically had access to every corner of Westeros, so if they wanted to poison or otherwise hinder the growth of dragons, they probably could. But I find these theories a little suspect. Dragons are clearly not indestructible beasts, but they do seem to be pretty hard to kill. If eliminating the dragons was easy enough that the Maesters or the Faith could diminish them so drastically in about a century, then the long-lasting dominance of the Valyrian freehold doesn't make a ton of sense. And I find the involvement of the Maesters or the Faith to be somewhat improbable simply because there are some easier and more obvious explanations as to why dragons went from Vhagar-sized to Arrax-sized, back to Drogon-sized for what appears to be no reason. One of the most obvious potential reasons for why the dragons got smaller was simply inbreeding. In the real world, when species experience genetic bottlenecks that result in a drastically minimized gene pool, they do oftentimes become unhealthy and go extinct. Species with massively reduced genetic diversity can die off because of that reduction, despite having much larger gene pools than the remaining dragons had as well. So it's not at all shocking that animals that probably had less than a dozen genetic ancestors to work with wound up weakening because of intense inbreeding. However, that theory is again pretty badly damaged by the size of Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal. There is also much speculation regarding where the dragon eggs that Daenerys had actually came from. But the most probable origin of Dany's dragons is a woman named Elisa Farman. Elisa Farman's story is actually a fascinating one, but the role that she potentially plays in the eventual resurrection of dragons is clearly what's relevant here. Alyssa Farman was a close companion of Princess Rhaena Targaryen, and they were likely in love with one another. As a result of her connection with the Targaryens, Alyssa was able to steal 3 dragon eggs, which she later sold to the Sea Lord of Braavos in 54 AC. Although Daenerys doesn't hatch her dragons until 299 AC, the connection seems to be obvious. 3 dragon eggs disappear, they're sold in Essos, and Daenerys is gifted 3 petrified dragon eggs in Essos around 2.5 centuries later. So this discrepancy in dragon sizes once again seems a bit odd. 54 AC is still somewhat early on in the Targaryen dynasty, so the dragons may have been stronger then. But even more confusingly, Daemon's dragon Caraxes is almost certainly born around the exact same time that these eggs were stolen. Caraxes' first rider was actually Prince Aemon Targaryen, and he was born in 55 AC, so it's safe to assume that Caraxes was likely born in the same year. And, while Caraxes is clearly more formidable than dragons like Arrax, it's worth noting that Caraxes appears to be around the size of Dany's dragons, or somewhat smaller than them, in House of the Dragon. The introduction of Caraxes is also an oddly specific one, because while the Alyssa Farman egg theory is unconfirmed, the fact that these eggs disappeared in 54 AC, and Caraxes was probably born in 55 AC, means that Caraxes was likely part of the same generation of dragons that Drogon, Viserion, and Rhaegal are, and could even be a part of the same clutch of eggs. So even if the decline of the dragons is because of a lack of genetic diversity, it's baffling that a dragon like Caraxes wouldn't even be as big as Drogon, Viserion, or Rhaegal after 50 years when Dany's dragons grew to their enormous size in under 5. At first glance, this might seemingly lend credence to the theory that the Maesters and/or the Faith were doing something to hinder the dragons. Because if Caraxes is a part of the same generation of Dany's dragons, or is even essentially their sibling, then there has to be something to explain the size difference. But once again, I'm inclined to disbelieve these theories, simply because, if the Faith or the Maesters were doing something to poison or stunt Caraxes, it's weird that there doesn't seem to be anything wrong with him. He is undeniably a very bizarre-looking dragon, but if his physical state was a result of something that was done to hinder or damage his development, then it again doesn't make sense within the context of Dany's dragons. If something was done to make Caraxes the Bloodworm, it had to have happened before he was hatched. And if something had been done to his egg to make him somehow deformed, then Dany's eggs probably would have been altered in the same way, and thus her dragons should also look weird. But Caraxes' bizarre appearance seems to be a one-off, and doesn't seem to have any adverse health effects on him. So the likelihood that some outside human influence made him smaller than Dany's dragons seems low. So now that I've offered up a few major explanations as to why the dragons became so small over time, and then explained why I don't think those explanations make sense, this is the explanation that I think does make sense. The reason that the Targaryen dragons became smaller and smaller after they invaded Westeros was ironically because they simply were not killing enough people to make them bigger. The Targaryen house words are some of the simplest in the story, but they are also some of the most interesting. What has always struck me as odd is that despite the fact that they are utterly obsessed with dragons, being the blood of the dragon, and they managed to conquer most of the continent because of dragons, they didn't choose house words that mention dragons. Fire and Blood is certainly straightforward and sounds badass, but it's not uncommon for George R.R. Martin to include deeper meanings into the mottos for houses. So it's extremely likely that House Targaryen's words are supposed to have more than one meaning. And what's even more interesting about Fire and Blood as a phrase is that it's a huge overarching theme that relates to far more than just the Targaryens. Literal blood and death is associated with a great deal of magical power, and as demonstrated by Melisandre and many of the other followers of R'hllor, burning people alive seems to be a source of great magical energy. Although dragon myth and fact are difficult to separate in A Song of Ice and Fire, the growth and potential size of dragons is actually directly addressed within the books. At least according to some, the potential for dragon growth is limitless. As long as a dragon has food and space to grow, it will supposedly continue to grow. However, dragons like Arrax obviously wouldn't have wanted for food and likely had enough space to at least grow far larger than he was after 14 years. So his diminutive size is pretty odd. But it also seems possible that dragons need to be fed with more than just literal food. They are extremely powerful magical creatures, so it seems plausible that they would need magical energy in order to grow. And the most obvious source of magical energy in Planetos seems to be human blood and death. Ergo, dragons like Velaryon and Vhagar might not have grown to such colossal proportions because of their age, but because they were tools being used to conquer all of Westeros, and thousands upon thousands of people were dying throughout that conquest. Similarly, the dragons of the Valyrian Freehold were supposed to be so large that it would make beasts like Velaryon look banal. But the Valyrian Freehold was an empire built on slavery where slaves were dying at an unfathomable rate. So it seems reasonable to assume that perhaps these magical creatures were feeding off of all of that free magical energy. In the same vein, Dany's dragons may have grown exponentially larger than Arrax in a fraction of the time, because thousands of people are dying in her conquest, essentially creating a ton of magical power that isn't really going to use, and could somehow be being absorbed by the dragons themselves. Which ironically means that it is entirely possible that the Targaryen dragons began to wither and grow smaller in the lead up to the Dance of the Dragons because, relatively speaking, not enough people were dying and not enough magical power was being created for them to consume and grow larger. Clearly, there will almost certainly never be a direct answer offered to explain why it is that the size and growth of the Targaryen dragons is so diverse and discrepant. George R.R. Martin has often said that the magic that exists within his world is a sword without a hilt, so some randomness, illogic, and uncontrollability can be explained away on that basis alone. However, elements of the world of ice and fire are rarely confusing or nonsensical without some hidden intention behind it. And this seems to be a plausible explanation as to why the Targaryens could have dragons as big as Vhagar and as small as Arrax. And, given the themes built around the Targaryens, Valyrians, and Dragon Lords, there is a fundamental and interesting irony around the notion that they lost their power because they stopped slaughtering people in order to gain it. But what do you think? Can Arrax's slow growth and the rapid decline of the dragons be explained in another way? Leave your comments and opinions below, and if you're interested in more content like this, like and subscribe.